Ivan Jovic-Abel. Ivan is an artist. He's not a philosopher, but he has conceived places and topoi to deposit what to instruct the philosopher and exchange with him or her. Who, like many contemporary artists, for whom the works are just the product of their activity as artists, Ivan has always reflected on the work of art. We have worked together, artist and philosopher. We have, through a book, Art Object, la topographie discrète topographie, given the means to build a new object that has both a matter art and a matter philosophy. It is a way to create a new ground, both sensitive and immanent, from which to build elements of discrete philosophy and or oscillations that can feed art. This project presupposes a method, what Ivan calls the concrete as a method, and which he will present to us. The work with Ivan brought me a concrete interpretation of the discrete philosophy, this one taking sense by the intervention of elements of exteriority. Thanks to Ivan.
Thank you so much for your words, Anne-Françoise. Indeed, I'm going to talk to you today about the discrete from my point of view as a visual artist, right? And on the potential it offers, I mean, the concrete in the interpretation of artworks and for the development of artistic research. I will do this through different examples, and I will particularly give you, of course, my own interpretation of the discrete for the art. And then if I have time, I would also like to present you shortly this book Anne-Françoise just talked about, and we wrote together, the topography discrete topography, which indeed I think it's also an example for the concrete in art and philosophy. So now let me try to share my screen again. So, do you see it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great.
Very good.
Good. So to begin, we have to ask ourselves, of course, what is the concrete, right? Even if we already talked a lot about it in this course, I would like to start here. And we can state that there is a lot of possible interpretations of the concrete, more or less contradictory to each other. They are the common meanings of the word, among which we can classify, for example, something like the opposite of abstract. But this definition, we will see, is not valid concerning the art. And then there are finer and more complex interpretations closer to the etymology of the word, as we have already seen in the course. And it's on this side that I will focus my presentation today. I will, of course, give you, as I said, my own definition of the concrete, which is close, I think, to the way it has been treated here, and to the way Anne-Françoise Schmid herself defines it. To say it very short, at this point, a dynamic more than a fixed point, and which requires the encounter of heterogeneous elements. But first, it is interesting, since we want to talk about art here, to notice that an artistic movement actually called itself concrete art. This term was used for the first time by Dutch artist Theo van Doesburg in 1930. Here is one of his paintings from 1918, and he created the movement with other artists of his generation in the continuity of what he had begun to create since 1917, and in a context where this kind of discourse and forms were emerging in different places in Europe and beyond. What did this term concrete refer to then for him? Far from being opposed to abstract art, concrete art was on the contrary intended as a further step into abstraction. Here is a diagram that I found and that was published in the second issue of the Cahiers de Réalité Nouvelle in 1948, and that traces the history of abstract art from Impressionism to the Salon des Réalités Nouvelles that took place that same year. The leap into abstraction made in the second decade of the 20th century by artists such as Vasily Kandinsky, Franciszek Kupka, Piet Mondrian, Kazimierz Malevich, and a lot of others, was a decisive effort in the adventure that propelled painting towards its autonomy. But concrete painting, according to Van Doesburg, was to mark a further step in this search for autonomy by a greater effort of rationalization and by freeing itself completely from the symbolist origins of abstraction and thus ridding it of animistic or esoteric aspect. A way to deny the transcendence, right? And to consider the form only for itself in an absolutely rational way. A form thus only a form that would be completely detached from reality and absolutely defined and mastered in a rigorous way with a concert for absolute clarity. And here there is a kind of manifesto where the pioneers summarized their intentions. Basis of concrete painting. We say, 1, art is universal. 2, the work of art must be entirely conceived and formed by the mind before its execution. It must not receive anything from nature's formal elements or from sensuality or sentimentality. We want to exclude lyricism, drama, symbolism, etc. 3, the painting must be entirely built with purely plastic elements, namely surfaces and colors. A pictorial element does not have any meaning beyond itself. As a consequence, the painting has no other meaning other than itself. 4, the construction of the painting, as well as that its element, must be simple and visually controllable. 5, the painting technique must be mechanic, meaning exact, anti-impressionist. And 6, there must be an effort for absolute clarity. Although Van Doesburg disappeared the year following the creation of this movement, we can note many common points between what we should call his doctrine, right, and other approaches developed notably by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and other artists in the Bauhaus, or among the constructivists in Russia, as well as in Poland with the unism of Władysław Stremiński. All this research also have in common the potential they offered for applications outside the field of art. Applications that are quite practical and in direct contact with reality and society through typography, architecture, and design. Concrete art, theorized by the pioneers, has thus offered a real method, a way of conceiving the form and beyond, a real vision of the world, And this vision has endured over the generation. First in Switzerland, in Zurich, with artists such as Max Biel or Camille Greza. And then we can find traces of this impulse in France in the 50s with artists like François Morlet, for example. And in the United States, of course, with Frank Stella, Carl Andre, Dan Flavin, or Donald Judd. And I could go on and quote many others and continue the filiation until today, but this is not the exact point of my presentation today. However, if you are interested, I can only advise you to take a look at the work done by the Espace de l'Art Concret in France, which is dedicated precisely to continuing this filiation through the great collection of Sibyl Albers and Gottfried Honegger. But for what concerns us today, it's now appropriate, I guess, that I tried to define the way in which I consider the concrete. And I apologize at this point if I repeat certain things that have already been said by others during this course. What interests me in the first place in the concrete is the necessity of the point of a point of exteriority. I will consider indeed that the concrete can only result from the encounter between quite heterogeneous elements. This definition that Anne-Françoise Schmid offered us in this course is completely relevant to evaluate the art and allows, I believe, to raise certain aspects of artworks, perhaps less obvious, and especially to build new relations between artworks which are at first sight very distant. It's actually a labor with, to my knowledge, has not been done yet, and of which I will only roughly sketch the general ideas here today. I'm going for that to take the simplest and most obvious examples that appears to us and that has already been mentioned by Anne-Françoise. The concrete, I mean, the construction materials that we called concrete, right? It is the result of the encounter between absolutely heterogeneous elements, namely water, sand, and cement. And this encounter, surprisingly, does not produce a consensus between these materials, namely sandy water or wet sand, but by a kind of hypercompatibility beyond the obvious contradiction, an entirely new material, very hard, which has nothing sandy or liquid anymore. And this is the very image I will have in mind during my presentation. It is this conception where the introduction of a point of exteriority makes it possible to create something completely new, a new materiality or a new dimension which interests me. Regarding the concrete art, again, if it refuses explicitly any point of exteriority to the form, we can, as we have seen previously, notice applications outside the fields of art, but which claim the method of it, giving its real extent to the movement. So I guess I could, let me say, to try to stick to my definition, that concrete art becomes really concrete when it ceases to be art. But that would be probably a too hazardous definition or interpretation. And not only too hazardous, but also unnecessary reducing, right? Because the point of exteriority here is in fact not to be found in the work itself, I mean, in the form that it proposes, but in its very presence, of course. The fact that it is deliberately detached from any reality, from any representation, and from any function, places it de facto with regard to the spectator in a kind of exterior, a discrete and autonomous universe but which becomes concrete through the encounter with the eye of the spectator. One does not penetrate a painting of Mondrian as one penetrates a landscape of Caspar David Friedrich. We stay outside, right? We do not enter the depth of the painting. There is no hidden world to be reconstructed behind Mondrian's line, like the one hidden behind Friedrich's mountains. The colored frame that rigorously divides the abstract space of the canvas represent for us, spectators, a point of total exteriority that makes its presence absolutely concrete. We are thus in front of a particular form of concreteness produced by the art, because it is one of the qualities of the art, right? To be able to create exceptions, regions which are not reflected in the reality, neither mirror nor metaphor of the reality, just a presence. In 1985, the artist duo Fischli and Weiss created their famous series entitled Stiller Nachmittag, Quiet Afternoon, also known as Equilibrium. It is a series of 45 photographs that document everyday objects arranged in a very precarious way, in an unstable equilibrium, but just captured in their moment of stability before the collapse. Each of the photographs has a title that evokes in a more or less precise, grotesque, or humorous way the scene represented. Some of the titles suggest dramatic scenarios giving the object's personality, as with here, Mrs. Peer bringing her husband a freshly ironed shirt for the opera. The boy smokes. Or here, Mrs. and Mrs. Peer with their new dog. And others are less anecdotal, but still very evocative, like expanding universe, tenderness, or artificial intelligence. The fascinating thing about this series is that the only reason for their existence, for the existence of these arrangements, is the point of equilibrium that they complete. Fischli said in an interview, "We discovered that we could leave all formal decisions to the equilibrium itself. And it's precisely in this precarious point of equilibrium that the concrete is located. At the moment when these heterogeneous elements that have no practical reason to be assembled form an equilibrium, giving new meaning to their presence." In a text entitled Salt and Pepper for Reality, Reinhard Schumacher writes about this series: order in the form of dramatic fragility becomes the rule for art, while remanding an exception in reality. This exception of reality can also be considered as one of the avatars of the concrete, one of the way in which it manifests itself in art as elsewhere. This strange moment, remember, where water in contact with sand and cement is transformed into stone, a new matter beyond contradictions. It is also interesting to note the subtitle of the series. Am schönsten ist das Gleichgewicht kurz bevor es zusammenbricht. The most beautiful is the balance just before it collapses. We can indeed almost perceive the coming collapse, right? We stay suspended in the scene, aware of the drama, aware that the drama will not happen on the smooth surface of the photo, but also aware of the scene that immediately followed the shooting in reality. We almost feel the movement without seeing it, and it reminds us in a grotesque, naive, and humorous way of the effort made by Renaissance painters and sculptors to give a sense of movement and elevation to the static bodies through what they called the linea serpentinata. Here, the spiritual elevation simply gives way to the small, banal collapse of everyday life. One could almost perceive in it the illustration of the famous Marx quote, "History always repeats itself twice, the first time as a tragedy, the second time as a farce." But if we follow this track in a more serious way, we realize that the serpentine line also in its own way comes to manifest the concrete, in that it constructs a new dimension. I mean that it always needs a new dimension to develop. And this is as much true of Renaissance painting or sculptures as it is of Laruelle's way of sizing this notion, the way he recognizes it in Robesson, for example. I draw the following directly from my understanding of the reading of Laruelle's book, Phenomenon and Difference, and more particularly from the chapter, The Serpentine Line and the Expression of Difference. The thinking of thought, the first principle of nature, the movement of the soul, which unceasingly returns toward itself in a perfect circular movement, needs a certain displacement of or spreading in order to be communicated. The serpentine line preserves the circular structure of the soul, the return to oneself, while allowing by a spatial displacement or shift into a new plane, the diffusion of the principle. So it's allow the principle to disperse while keeping its unity. I schematize this dynamic as follows. According to a particular view, let's say from above, here on the left of the diagram, the movement is perfectly circular and repetitive. But if we change the perspective, we realize that the circularity developed by snaking toward the depth in the third dimension along the z-axis on my diagram. I take the liberty here of showing you this diagram, even if for Laruelle, it is simply not possible to visually schematize the dynamics of the flexuous line in this way. What the serpentine line allows, a continuous reference to oneself, an affectation of self by itself, as you say, at the same time as a continuous decentering in relation to oneself cannot be conceived from a spatial representation or schema. The movement of the serpentine line, concentrated and decentrated at the same time, allows to envelop the differences in its circularity and thus to save them by giving them their raison d'être by a mode of organization from which springs the grace. There is in the static movement or in the static in movement induced by the serpentine line, a part which escapes the geometry founded on the spread of the space. From this elusive and irresistible elevation of the immobile masses, grace arises. And one certainly cannot schematize grace. But it seems to me, nevertheless, that the passage by the schematization, although imperfect, allows to concretize in some way the necessary construction of additional dimensions to allow the flexuous development of the serpentine line. In the same way, these flat geometric figures are transformed into cubes as soon as we change the perspective. But on a closer look, we are unable to locate the direction of rotation. The direction varies depending on whether we place one or the other face in the foreground. these figures turn at the same time to the right and to the left. This contradiction cannot be schematized. To size this reality, it would be necessary to invent new dimensions. In the same way, again, to take up an example dear to Anne-Françoise, that Michelangelo's Moses in the Basilica di San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, in his complex geometry, seems at the same time to stand up in anger and to sit down in despair. Here too, we would have to construct new dimensions to grasp this ambiguous geometry where elements coexist while excluding each other. Until we can build this new dimension, another approach consists, on the contrary, in subtracting dimensions, choosing precisely the angle that cancels the perspective. Imagine a space without depth. Here, we are suddenly propelled into the very exception of reality. Into a space without depth, and therefore both infinite and non-existent. A universe reduced to zero, where paradoxically, it is the invisible that is shown. I realized this installation following an experience at the same time banal and very impressive. A walk on a beach in the middle of a fog that did not let us see anything more than a few meters away. In total loss of our usual landmarks, and with for only vision a white wall rising in front of us and evolving according to our own progression. That day, this direct confrontation with a moving, closed space, imposing on the body an impassable border, gave me a first intuition of what could be an intermediate space, neither really outside nor really inside. A visible space and yet non-existent in itself. A space that truncates space, transforming volumes into undifferentiated gray surfaces, seemed to ignore the interior, the deep. With this installation, I wanted to thematize the ambiguous moment of the passage between the flat and the deep, the interior and the exterior, the visible and the invisible, and to make this passage more uncertain by placing the spectator in a sort of intermediate zone. Here, we have a form of the concrete that takes the absolute opposite of the concrete art as theorized by Van Doesburg. Not a discrete exterior space that does not allow itself to be penetrated and thus assert its total autonomy, but an encompassing space that traps while denying the space itself. A form of presence that, rather than asserting its autonomy, denies its reality, thus creating an exception that the viewer experiences rather than perceives. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice.
Bravo, bravo. C'est magnifique.
Merci.
C'est magnifique, vraiment. Vraiment.
I'm just quickly open for Brandon and Zane if they want to ask Ivan anything or respond in any way. I mean, sure. I think it was, yeah.
I mean, I thank you for the lecture. It's been a while since I've had an art lecture, so that was really good. I couldn't help thinking throughout the whole thing, like I specifically studied like neo-concretism and Brazilian art in my undergrad, and I can't help but thinking that there's this one work that was like a collaboration between Ferrer Goulart and Elio Itzica. which is this environment that you like walk through, which has these sort of like primary colors, and you go through like a sort of series of rooms ending in a thing with a box that you pull out, and it has a like one word in Portuguese, which has like 7 different meanings. And so there's this like the point of exteriority is like the experience of the artwork itself, like it is like this thing that you have to walk through, and then at the end you have this reduction of perspectives, which I think reduces this phenomenal like ability to contextualize things in a way. And when you're talking about walking through the fog, I feel like that's like a similar thing. And then you're faced with this word that has like 6 different meanings, and you no longer have the sort of perspectival like invariance to be able to sort of decide what the meaning is supposed to be. And I think interestingly enough, like that for me at least draws a connection between the like neo-concretist art in Brazil and like concretist art in France, because like previously, other than like a sort of like a aesthetic affiliation, like I just never really had that sort of like direct connection with that before. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Could you? I'm not very familiar with neo-concretism, and but I know that it was very important for concept art and so on. But could you give us the reference of the artwork just talked about in the chat, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I'll send a link with it.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. That would be awesome.
In my understanding, like the neo-concretist stuff in Brazil was also largely based on their sort of like lack of like material import export. Like it was tied to the economy in a lot of ways, because they sort of stopped importing stuff and wanted to just like create everything there. So it became like a more direct metaphor with the concrete, as you were talking.
Yeah. Great.
Anything from Zane, or no? You don't have to respond, but
yeah, no, yeah, thank you for the lecture. Yeah, it's not just my first art lecture in a while, but my first art lecture ever. So I enjoyed it, and yeah, I'll think on it. But yeah, thank you.
thank you. Anne-Françoise, I'm going to be speaking for a moment, so I can't chat. I can't. I'll catch back up with the chats. But Ivan, I thank you very much for that. I mean, thanks for also paying attention to the course and like really driving in the final concepts for us and bringing them back. That was really, that's something we kind of have been always bringing back, but we didn't have a direct presentation, so that was really great. I wonder, like you shared this, this flat space, this like is that's, I assume that's that was like a visual presentation of a space, or was an installation that you did?
Yeah. This was an installation I made in 2010 in Bern, Switzerland, and the 2 figures were painted on the window of the gallery, and the gallery was completely empty. Just 2 lights were on the ground for the night, and then yeah, basically the installation, you could see it's 24 hours a day. It was night and day there, and there were times where you could enter the gallery and lost yourself in the space.
In the fog.
Yeah, in the fog. Yeah, and then try to find out the door again.
This in-between space that you're describing, that you're like, you know, it's like the embodied space of the spectator, incorporating the spectator into the artwork, right? And I'm wondering if there's, because you worked with Anne-Françoise and you're well aware and everything, and I'm wondering, you know, I know you made this a while ago, but I mean, when you after the installation was over and everything, was there any sense of a collective, like, was it like a collective experience, or was it always like individual, like, liminal space experience?
What do you mean exactly? What by collective experience?
I guess I'm trying to bridge it with collective intimacy. I'm trying to
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
prompt
Okay.
you then to ask you another question about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's. I mean, it's always tough to say, right? Because it's. As an artist, I'm doing it not in the first place to say something. I just wanted to make that experience. That seems important to me to do it, but it's not like I don't have a statement at that point. And I guess there were something like a collective intimacy happening there, because the public was having the same experience at the same time, which and it's a quite unusual experience to have. And also because the public, they don't knew what they most of them thought they are going to show a painting show, because this is what I do most of the time. And suddenly there were no painting and just an empty space with fog. So I guess they were like a collective experience that happened. But it wasn't my point really, I guess, or I don't know if I had a point at that time.
Yeah, I don't mean to box your work into like a specific thing. I'm just abstracting that to see if we can pull out any of the other concepts. Yeah, because I'm interested in I am interested in the concept of like liminal space and how it sort of differs from generic space. So yeah. I was just seeing if anything would be prompted from that.
Yeah.
But Bryn has posted the relations, the suggestions. Anne-Françoise, do you have anything, or do you need me to help you catch up?
Yes. The discussion is very original. The experience is very original. We had the habit to inverse the perspectives, as in Florensky, Pavel Florensky, the Russian philosopher, or in mine school with the perspectograph. And you do not need the perspectograph. You invent a new perspectograph. It's extraordinary.
Thank you.
Very nice. What new works are you preparing or working on, or do you have a show coming up or something that I know you have the book with Anne-Françoise?
Yeah, I've been working on that book for the most of 2020, because I not only write it with Anne-Françoise, but I also made the layout, which was a huge task.
I have the book and it's really beautiful. So
thank you.
Very good job.
And Bryn is a book letter, so she does this as well. So
thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
Yes.
So yeah, but yeah, I have of course projects and shows coming up, and I'm working. Basically, I'm always working on different series at the same times, and then there is times where one series takes more importance than other. Yeah, it's very difficult to talk about images without seeing them. but most of the time, to put it in a shell, I am a painter, you could say, because I'm painting most of the time. But when I display the painting, it's often takes the dimension of an installation. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the space is incorporated a lot in the.
Yeah, and I'm also very,
the frame.
Sorry?
Sorry, the outside of the frame is the.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I'm also very interested in architecture, so I'm always trying to respond in a way to the architecture of the place where I'm displaying my paintings.
So maybe like this is not the best question, but I find it interesting, like, because so when I was reading like Laurel's work, like the photo fiction, like these photography, it doesn't exist visually, but it's speaking about normally a visual activity, or the philosophical operas, right? I have this dream that I would be able to create this opera that he will be able to, that he said, and I wonder, like, with the idea, like, have you worked or experimented with the idea of the integrative object in painting?
I'm not really familiar with that notion, and I try most of the time to not conceptualize I like the exact opposite of what I said about the concrete art, like not having in mind what I want to do, and I it's more or less experiences that I suddenly recognize and as an artwork, and then I can fix them and decide whether they are good enough or not. But I'm not trying in the first place to think before doing things, and that's why for me, like writing, for instance, is not, I never write about my own work, and writing is just the same. I'm trying to do the same thing. It's just another way of expressing myself, and one doesn't have to reflect the other one. It's the way I'm doing it. So, yeah.
Right. I guess just for. Sorry, go ahead, Zane. Go ahead.
I was going to ask a follow-up question, but also related to your presentation, which was, it seemed like in the concrete art there was a kind of commitment to being very exact or clear, or like a principle of clarity, which it seemed like you'd link to there being some indeterminacy in the art because it's not trying to represent anything in particular. I know that you like you just said that your art or your art practice doesn't start from these kinds of I guess from a manifesto as such, as a way of, but do you find that relation between being very exact and creating something indeterminate useful in your art practice? Do you find that it comes up in your art practice?
Yeah, probably at some level, probably, but again, I'm trying as much as I can not to think when I paint, and this is why it's very difficult for me to talk about it, because it's so I can talk about it in the form of a text that's not where I'm not directly talking about it. Like, I think I'm talking, in the book, I'm writing about the way I'm doing art without writing about the art. So, yeah.
Yeah, I also have a question. All of this stuff around like a point of exteriority in order to sort of like experience things in a different way, just it does seem like extremely connected to sort of phenomenology. And I know that you're not like a philosopher at all, but like I wonder what your connection is to sort of that practice, which seems like resolutely philosophical. And yeah, I mean, it's always been a question for me in terms of like the relationship of like art to something like phenomenology, which is kind of about like controlling or like sort of distilling a phenomenal experience, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is interesting. So I don't know if I can respond really exactly because yeah, I'm not a philosopher and this is not my field. This is not my specialty, and I'm really not in my zone, which is what I appreciate about it. But what it's interesting because actually I fall into philosophy first reading Merleau-Ponty and Bachelard and Gaston Bachelard, and I guess that the encounter with Anne-Françoise Schmid and L'Oréal's work took me away from this very phenomenological way of thinking. But this is just a guess. I don't know exactly what it's doing with me, because I never really tried to reflect on that since I'm not producing philosophy myself. And I never studied philosophy, so I'm really like I'm really a stranger here.
I mean, at least for me, the like Merleau-Ponty, for instance, is someone whose work I'm working pretty closely with. He does seem to have this like elegant sort of exit from philosophy at a certain point when he starts working with like clinical patients, and he basically like is like this argument over what is the object is easily escapable by saying that we are all finite beings and we have bodies and we can never know that and it's fine, and then just moves on. Which I think I really appreciate about him. But yeah, like this, he also does a lot of work on painting.
Yeah. This is why he was pretty familiar to me, and I wanted to read him because he wrote a lot about painting and the way we perceive things, and it's of course very important for painter and visual artists to know this text.
Yeah, I feel like the one like essay on Cézanne where he says like Cézanne takes the body with him, I think is like it seems like a very influential sort of like thought towards like painting nowadays, where it's like it's both the painting of the object and also the experience of it is something that our bodies also have to experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, oh yes, go ahead. I was gonna open it up for you, Anne-Françoise.
Yes, there is an imaginary letter between Félix Klein and Cézanne. And Félix Cézanne wrote to Cézanne, Cézanne wrote to Félix Klein to said, I made the same work in painting than you in mathematics. I destroy the forms. This letter was 10 years ago, things as a really letter, because the analysis of Cézanne was very, very important. And it was the creation of a painter, Maurice Mathieu, who was too a mathematician, and another person of the International College of Philosophy. It is very important. But for the phenomenology, it is a problem, because phenomenology have great identities, given identities, the subject, the object, etc., etc. And the thesis of François Laruelle would be edited next year. Économie générale des effets d'être. Les effets, c'est les modes d'être. Économie générale des effets d'être. And this thesis is a great movement to destroy these identities with the device of Nietzsche, the crepuscule of idols. And with the collaboration of diverse philosophies, very different, we can create a new matter, philosophical matter. The movement, the topoi, so it's no more exactly phenomenology. Non-phenomenology. The non had not an exclusion exactly, but a transformation as the dimension in experience of Joevenn. It's a very, it's an experience to have non-phenomenology. Not exactly the same as Merleau-Ponty. Not exactly the same. Voilà.
In the sense of like when you're describing the non-philosophy, you're describing the philosophy without the subject, right? So without
Without subject, but with individuals, probabilistic individuals. And when they change of state, they becomes little messiah. But it's not the person as you or I. It's a transformation.
And I can see that with when you enter the gallery in the example that Ivan gave of his work. You enter the gallery and it's like the loss of your this like liminal space gives you a sort of now I guess to like the losing of one's identity or losing of one's I guess like a security of point of your subjectivity. You're in a space where you're being confused of all your expectations and things. Yeah, but it becomes difficult when I start to think of what a phenomenology is, non-phenomenology. That's a difficult one for me.
Can I just interject here? I just joined a research group here at Concordia called the Topological Media Lab. And we're doing work on projects specifically right now about turbulence as a phenomenological experience, but some of the research projects that are going on in the lab are like the creation of clouds. So we're building like a robotic system that creates like a weather system so that in a gallery so that one can observe the way in which clouds work in a sort of phenomenal way. And one of the sort of readings that we're doing is Casey, Edward Casey, around like edge phenomenology and like what is it that delineates objects in our experience and what delineates subjects. And one of the ways in which that sort of like breaks down. And I think that like some of the things, the interesting thing about this project is that it's extremely interdisciplinary. We have like students from like the sort of like sciences dealing with weather. We have engineers who are creating this thing. We have artists who are designing it and interacting with it. And then also philosophers who are thinking about these sort of like delineations of what those things are and if they're necessary, or like how to rethink those things phenomenologically. And so it seems like this project is like also very similar to this work of non-phenomenology. Like how do we have a phenomenology without like delineations between subject and object? And like I don't know, I think it's like somewhat pertinent to those questions.
Yeah, I think you're gonna have a lot of the, I mean, at the edge of things, like you're like at the precipice of what Anne-Françoise speculates or theorizes about, I guess. Over that edge is like where she wants to be, or where she's acting. When you're talking about this is kind of slight tangent, but I just wanted to mention it to you since you're doing the weather thing. You do you know like the Stalinist group that was working with that were like the weather scientists?
No, I'm not familiar. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna send that to you. There's a whole Stalinist like university institute that was made to control the weather. There's also, yeah, and then the idea of clouds is a geopolitical issue too. I don't know if you're like, because China has a cloud maker that they were using during the World Cup. Russia as well. Those are interesting topics, but I don't know if they come into your work. But I will try to find it.
Injecting any sort of politics into phenomenology is probably a good idea.
Yeah. Do we have any other direct questions for Ivan or not? We'll keep up with him. We'll share his work, of course. He always works with us. He works with Anne-Françoise more than me, of course. And I want to just formally thank you for preparing and being able to share your work with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So what I want to talk to you about is we want to do a slight extension of this course, like more now. This is supposed to be the last session of the course, but now we want to do this sort of publication or collective publication, whatever we might want to do from this work that we've done. So, and Joevenn couldn't be here today because of some issues with travel, and we just really wanted the final session to be the three of us since we started the collective course, and I would love to have Joevenn be involved. So we were gonna suggest that we meet like after the holidays, and I don't know if, like, I'm looking at a calendar, like we could either meet after the full holidays, like so at the beginning of next year, or we could meet mid-December. Does it matter for either Zane or Bryn? Or are you traveling? Will you be available for a Saturday sometime mid-December, or would you
I feel
prefer?
like regardless, I'm not traveling too far, so I'll be able to meet on a Saturday. I think for me at least, the weekend of, what is it, the December like 18th is like.
Yeah, there's the 18th. There's the 18th is the week before.
Yeah, that would work the best for me for a Saturday, but I'm also.
The 18th, it is impossible for me.
Impossible for Anne-Françoise. Okay.
Ah, non, attention, je me suis trompé de moi. Non. Yes, it's possible.
Okay.
Yes.
Zane?
Yeah, I think the 18th would work. I don't know what we're thinking about between now and then. If we are like thinking about developing, work in that time period, that would be difficult for me just because
we're not going to guarantee, like, okay, so we're not going
proposals out.
Got it. Yeah, so you're going to be,
Yeah.
that's like what,
In the new
February
year,
for you?
I'd be aiming to get everything out by sort of mid-December, essentially. So in the new year, I'd be a bit clearer.
Okay.
But you know, it's not a reason to derail everything. But yeah.
Well, I'm also
Also available in the new year as well.
So why don't we do this? Why don't we just have an informal check it? Like we'll keep up with emails about what we should be, like what we can be preparing, like what we want to prepare. Let's say the 18th of December, we have a short meeting, like no work to be done, but we're going to be then planning for the work in January. So let's just try to like absorb the kinds of stuff we have done in the course. And we'll meet on the 18th informally for however long we want to discuss. We'll discuss like what we want to do. I think that we have like questions on whether or not we want to go with the collective voice or we want to do individual, what kind of format. And then that will give us, then we'll like maybe take a month to work on our own stuff and then meet again in the beginning of, or at the beginning of the year in January. And we can set that date on the 18th. So Zane, if you're not able to make it on the 18th, we'll just keep you updated with what's going on. And then, yeah, we'll kind of just kind of extend the group a little bit, and we'll just so today we'll end a little bit early, I think, and that so we can because we'll have the final conversations coming up at the last two. So and we'll make sure that you both can be available, whether or not we schedule them now. We'll make sure with email. Is it okay with everybody?
Yeah, it sounds good to me. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Very good. Very good.
So I think then without taking too much then today, I think we should end on Ivan's awesome presentation to just take home with us. And I hope you all have a good time in the next couple of weeks. I'll see you on the 18th. And let's just say at the same time that we normally meet on Saturday. So it'll be the same kind of thing on a Saturday at the whatever your time is. Mine is noon or whatever. But Ivan, you're welcome to join. You're welcome to be a part of this next thing we're gonna work on. This if you want to contribute or just be a part of it. We'll kind of like, you know, just kind of roll you into the process.
Great.